Joining me now is Tristan Snell. He's the former Assistant Attorney General for New York, who led the office's investigation into Trump University. He also is the author of the book Taking Down Trump: 12 Rules for Prosecuting Donald Trump by Someone Who Did It Successfully. Tristan, thank you very much for joining us. I know you're just pouring through the filing, but what stands out to you and what are you finding?
Well, first off, I'm still trying to get information, just as you are. I really hope that that's 175 million and not 175,000.
Yeah, right. It's right.
175 million was already, in my view, way too low. I think the appeals court botched this badly by allowing him to get off the hook, letting him, be able to post much less and give him more time to do it. As I've said, I think it's akin to taking a team that was going to lose a basketball game by 40 points and giving them 5 more minutes to play and lowering the hoop from 10 feet down to 6. It shouldn't have happened, and now we see where it gets us.
So just to clarify for everybody, it is $175 million. So where does this take us now in this appeals process? What does it look like? What should we be expecting?
Yeah, look, there was always a chance in this situation that the court would lower the amount that Trump would have to pay. There is also a chance that they could vacate or overturn the judgment entirely. I think the odds of that are lower. I think there is an absolute mountain of evidence supporting the finding of fraud in this case. It is possible, and I would say now it looks likely, that the appeals court will lower that award down from $464 million down to something that I still hope is going to be north of $175 million. We have to remember something here, Michael. Every dollar that Trump is being asked to pay now is a dollar he shouldn't have been lent to begin with, and would not have been lent were it not for all of his lies.
How does this play out with other folks out there in the financial markets who are looking at this whole process, given that there are other scenarios in which Trump could be held liable? How does this $175 million bond, when the judgment was $454 million, get reconciled? What is the rest of this story with respect to the difference between what was awarded and versus what he has to put up for a bond?
Yeah, look, I think anybody who's looking to lend Trump money or underwrite anything for him right now has got to be looking at this and saying, look, what next? It's not a great situation for him overall. And if you have other different loans outstanding with him, how well is he going to be able to actually repay these? I think that ultimately he's not going to win this appeal. He might get it lowered, but I don't think he's going to win it. I don't think he's going to win the appeal against E. Jean Carroll. I don't think that's happening. Again, that could get lowered a bit. I don't think it's going to get lowered all the way to zero or anywhere close. If you lent money to Donald Trump, and especially given his track record, I think that might not have been the best idea.
Put that money to some other uses. So like all things with Donald Trump, how long do you think this is going to take? Is there something that, we should be looking at being dragged out, or is this something that could get turned around pretty quickly?
Yeah. Donald Trump's biggest weapon when he's trying to evade justice, and I talk about this a ton in my book, is delay. Ultimately, a lot of the things that he does, what are all these distractions, the clown car full of lawyers? What is he trying to do here? He's just trying to throw sand into the gears of justice, try to actually stop it from happening. And then he hopes that this is going to cause other things to break his way. And in the context of the election, he's hoping that it's going to allow him somehow to win and then be able to wave some sort of magic kingly wand and, monarch or dictator his way out of all of this. So I think he is going to try to delay these appeals for as long as he can. But critically, I think the AG's office should be trying to seek expedited review of this case, because Donald Trump has already been moving money around. He moved $40 million out of the Trump Organization to pay private legal costs that he had, a tax bill plus some of the money that he owes to E. Jean Carroll. And he did that against a court order, in violation and basically in secret, away from the eyes of the court-ordered monitor. So there's already a clear track record here that Donald Trump is the financial equivalent of a flight risk. He is going to try to make this money disappear. And as a result, the AG's office should say, we need to move faster before all of this money is gone, and the right of the people to this money is frustrated. Justice is frustrated.
So Tristan, on that point, because he is a financial flight risk in that regard, but he does have these assets out there that we also have talked about over the last couple of weeks. Where does that money come from? What is the collateral, do you think, that's behind this $175 million bond? Because I'm sure, you know, the folks who posted it got to attach it to something. So what does that look like?
Look, there have been a lot of reports that underwriters did not want to use his properties as collateral. We don't know exactly how this is working. It could be the properties. It could be revenue streams from the properties. It could be cash that he has on hand. My understanding is that he's not allowed to do anything that commits the stock that he has in this new Truth Social public company SPAC. That would actually be against his lockup. He's not allowed to actually get rid of any of that stock for 6 months. And I don't believe that he's allowed to have anything use that as collateral either. It's possible that some other folks who understand that wing of the Trump legal saga would be able to weigh in differently on that. But my understanding is that he cannot encumber that stock. So some combination of all of those things, we don't know. It's a mystery as to really why anybody would, given the human wreckage that he has created with all of the vendors and business partners that he's screwed over, the people that he ruined by going into bankruptcy as well, you'd think that people would think twice before lending him or underwriting him a nickel. But there you go.
Well, as in all things, Tristan, follow the money, right? That's what you need to do in this situation. Tristan Snell, thank you so much, my friend, for being on with us tonight.
Hey, everyone. MSNBC has a new and improved app. You'll get real-time alerts and analysis, live blogs, in-depth essays, video highlights, and the best 2024 election coverage. Download the new MSNBC app. Here's how to do it. You tap on the App Store on your phone. You hit search on the bottom right corner. You type in MSNBC. You click on the MSNBC app. You click on Get or the cloud icon and enjoy it.